in Portuguese, my comrades translated for me because I don't really trust my English, so I might be reading a bit because of the English, if that's right for you. I'll start briefly contextualizing how Brazilian society was born in the way making direct links with Bolsonaro's model of government. I will then briefly talk about the rise of the far-right in Brazil, which has led to Bolsonaro's victory, and the feminist movement, which represents the biggest resistance against his government to date. As we know, Brazil as we know it today was born from a colony of exploitation, and we must keep in mind that that is how Brazilian society was formed, as a culture of colonized people, not a colonizer. And we must be aware of the many differences that exist between these two classes. The Brazilian class struggle is based on the race issue, in view of the slave model built in Brazil and the lack of public policies for black people since the abolition of slavery. The servant-style work was and is maintained, the slave model of labor, the housing problem, the emergence of the favelas, the lack of a system of high-quality public education and healthcare. All of this has been maintained since abolition, since the time of Brazilian Empire. In order to stay in power after the abolition of slavery, the colonials, white men, created a myth of Brazilian racial democracy, where they say there was social, political, and economic equality among the rights in Brazil, with no real intention to giving black people equal rights, while neglecting the problems that black people faced. The small groups of power, the small oligarchies, exempted, thank you, themselves from any responsibility towards black communities, and maintain certain patterns of the old regime that would benefit the interests of their own class, because only one class, right? Through the myth of Brazilian racial democracy, the propagated idea was that they dedicated themselves attentively to such matters, when in fact they did not. And there begins the Brazilian political system, with its roots in coronelismo, in politics by and for oligarchies. We cannot forget that the Brazilian standard of successful people was shaped in this colonial period, and we cannot deny the existence of a dominant group that seeks to prolong the past and its ideologies and create a future on the basis of that past. The Brazilian dominant classes, dressed as the patriots since the time of the Brazilian Empire, have always imposed the exclusive interests of the nation they have always imposed their exclusive interests as the interests of the nation, and used the state as a weapon of oppression and to any opposition. Keeping black people in the favelas, known as modern senzalas, which is what slave camps were called in the colonial Brazil, where there is no access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and even the most basic rights such as access to clean water and basic sanitation, guaranteed by law to human beings, making social inclusion impossible. It is the coronelista model of politics. Electoral fraud, such as fake news, illegal financing of campaigns, purchase of votes and threats, agreements between politicians and businessmen, and that time landowners and the old coronéis. Bolsonaro has openly declared that he would govern for who he calls the majorities, which is, in this context, mean the oligarchies, the modern Brazilian coronels, rich white men from wealthy backgrounds, businessmen. In this way, his connection with the colonial model of making politics in Brazil is clear, and complemented by his past on the military, helped to explain his model of authoritarian politics. He glorifies dictatorships and tortures, has a totally archaic way of thinking with highly discriminatory positions, and lacks capacity to preside over a country. In such oligarchies, one is not required intellectual capacity. only power, good deals with businessmen, and the slashing of workers' rights, so that the class privileges are maintained. In 2013, we saw the Brazilian population going out on the streets in a great movement that began after a rise in the bus fares, called by Free Pass movement, Passe Livre, Brasil Passe Livre. It began questioning the absurd prices, poor quality, and corruption schemes in public transport. Such demonstrations become a great revolutionary spring and brought with them a process of politicization of the Brazilian population. We were all together on the streets, the traditional left with unions, traditional political parties of the Brazilian left, social movements, black bloc movements, nationalists, the conservative patriarch elite, right-wing groups. Constantly responded with police repression, this demonstration started to develop a new form. At one point, the PT, Brazilian Workers' Party, lost its power for being on the spotlight of corruption scandals and with the World Cup arriving in Brazil. And the participation of the traditional left on the streets decreased. On the other hand, there was a huge police repression to autonomous groups such as black blocs with extreme violence, and who remained on the streets were the conservatives and the traditional right. The traditional left remained hostage to the PT, Workers' Party in Brazil, and the Dilma government ended up criminalizing many social movements with the anti-terrorism law. At the same time, the corruption investigation operation Lava Jato titled PT as the most corrupt party in the country. Lava Jato didn't arrest only politicians from PT, but also from other political parties and a large part of the business class, which had always been involved in corrupt deals with Brazilian politicians. This is how we came to the coup of 2016. It had the full support of the business enterprises, who are the actual governing class in Brazil. With many right-wing politicians being implicated in the Lava Jato operation, including Michel Temer, who took over the presidency after the coup, as well as several members of the country's business elite, there was a kind of void in the political arena, and Bolsonaro emerged as the salvation for most of the Brazilian people, surprising even the traditional Brazilian right. With very little television time during the campaign, Bolsonaro began his campaign working through neo-Pentecostal churches, evangelical churches. Due to the lack of attention of the state in certain communities, these churches ended up exercising this social function, addressing social problems, and creating a network among the regulars. These people consequently ended up helping each other and glorifying the church and its pastors for this, with churches becoming providers of social benefits. With the strongly Christian population that Brazil has, through the churches, values like those of traditional family. Sorry.
Oh, it wasn't her. You won.
With the strongly Christian population that Brazil has, through the church, values like those of traditional family, as well as patriarchal and meritocratic ideas, such as if you work hard, God will give you double, were and continue to be reaffirmed. Just as in 1964, when people walked the streets with the motto, "The family with God for freedom," thus helping to establish the military dictatorship. We saw the same values applied to manipulate individuals in the Bolsonaro campaign. In the same way, the anti-PT movement was reaffirmed with speeches turning the PT into an enemy of the population rather than simply the political opposition. In addition, Bolsonaro used a gigantic package of fake news strategy in his campaign. Just a few days before Jair Bolsonaro won the elections, a Brazilian newspaper revealed that more than 150 companies had financed a multi-million-dollar anti-PT campaign via WhatsApp. Knowing that there is a huge tendency for people to accept information that converge with their pre-existing beliefs and to ignore information that challenges them, the fake news machine turned out to be a very effective tool. Bolsonaro emphasized in his speech how much the press is an enemy of the people, so that professional journalists' credibility were highly questioned and the fake news spread via WhatsApp were more easily taken in. The fake news were absurd and included scandalous lies about the PT, a massive amount of hate speech, and scenes of extreme violence, such as torture and extreme police violence in the favelas in Brazil. Fake news, the support of the neo-Pentecostal evangelical churches, and Bolsonaro's transparent hate speech functioned as a type of brainwashing. Allegedly, hate this word, sorry. Allegedly, many of those who voted for him already regret having allowed themselves such misleading. This is how Bolsonaro and the far-right came to power in Brazil. The greatest enemy of fascism is woman. In Brazil, we made this clear through the movement of Ele Não, a movement created, led, and formed by women who fought bravely to try to stop Bolsonaro's victory. Across Brazil and in dozens of cities abroad, Brazilian women went to the streets on September 29 with a single agenda: not him, ele não. There were women of several different ideological positions asking that people vote for any candidate as long as not him. In London, we were more than 1,000 marching in central London with the support of many comrades from other countries. Today in Brazil, women are fighting against a setback in their achievements and, above all, for their right to be able to go out in the streets, on a bus, on a tube, without being disrespected, harassed, or insulted, without being raped and or killed, and especially for the lives of black and marginalized women. To women, Bolsonaro translated into direct attacks, be they economic, such as reduction of social security and labor rights, or social, such as the possibility of greater criminalization of abortion, prohibition of debates about gender or violence in the schools. Bolsonaro is a macho figure whose campaign and parliamentary performance proves his hatred for any kind of manifestation in defense of women's rights. His political project represents the polar opposite of a feminist one. The feminist struggle will be the main source of resistance against Bolsonaro, since we, women, especially the black and marginalized women, are the first to feel the dismantling of democracy, the rights won, and the conservative, violent, and authoritarian attacks of the Bolsonaro government. After all, it was us, women, who were Bolsonaro's main enemies through the last years, denouncing his authoritarian, misogynist, and racist practice. Resistance is international. Projects similar to those of Bolsonaro, although with very different national specificities, have been growing. Specificities have been growing all over the world, but the opposite pole, radically democratic, feminist, and anti-capitalist, has also grown stronger. The last few 8th March has been characterized by extreme resistance against the right wing across the globe, and the ancient international women's strike has shown that working women continue to gather forces against those who hold the power. It is necessary to establish an international network of solidarity and fight against the barbarism of the conservatives. It is necessary and it's possible. Therefore, it is fundamental that we organize ourselves collectively, because we believe that together we are stronger, and this way we have solid conditions to face the conservatives. We need to organize networks of discussion and spreading information in person and through social networks, and to dispute the narrative about the nation, convincing people that democracy and social rights are essential pillars for healthy society. And without women in public and political space, there is no democracy. We must return to our place of work, whether they are schools, universities, or the labor market, to recruit more women to occupy the front line of this battle, not only against Bolsonaro, but against his speech and everything he represents. This next phase requires courage and union. We shall not let go of each other's hands. Ninguém solta a mão de ninguém. Sorry. Following on from 2017 and 2018, this 8th March will be even more important for our struggle and organization in this initial moment of resistance. Especially as March is not only being the month of women's struggle, but also the month which will mark 1 year since the execution of Marielle Franco. And we are yet left without answers. Who killed Marielle? Let's make our voice equal and multiply. Let's keep watch out for the appropriations that Bolsonaro's government makes of feminist guidelines in order to confuse women. And let's fight and shout out together. We invite all women to come along with us to form this resistance. The women's struggle changed the world, and together we are much, much stronger. Not him, Marielle presente, and thank you.